Okay, I think we can start. Okay. Well, esteemed guests, honorable ministers and senators, judges, scholars, and practitioners and colleagues, I welcome you all to our presentation. First of all, I'd like to thank the Faculty of Law of Fordham University for the invitation to New York. And just a few words about me. My name is Massimo Zizzari, and I am from Rome, Italy. I took my degree in law in Italy, and then I studied international law in Texas. I'm a Supreme Court lawyer in Italy, and I work in my own law firm that is based in Rome. And I practice mostly intellectual property law, commercial law, and international and domestic arbitration. And I lecture in comparative private law and Anglo-American law at the University of Molise in Italy, where I'm a PhD candidate. And I even lecture in public law and administrative law at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata. Finally, last year I've been appointed officer of the Italian Navy, and I served in some operational missions as a legal advisor and political advisor in human rights, security, rules of engagement, and international maritime law. So, this presentation will be about the impact of intellectual property law on the innovation and circulation of military technology. And since the beginning of modern state system, governments have made innovation in military technology a bureaucratic focus, bringing to bear capital and the attention of private industry in order to seek advantage over potential enemies. And today, many national governments sit at the top of a surprisingly complex system for military development. And I would say that during the Cold War, jurists and commercial lawyers dedicated a remarkable attention about how states pursued military innovation. And jurists developed some theories of military innovation, but only a few of those focused on how the legal environment affects the way that innovations are produced. And in part, these gaps arise from a deep division of disciplines that has separated the study of international law from the study of international security. Scholars of military innovation simply do not concentrate on legal factors, while scholars of international law rarely study how military organizations make procurement decisions. And this has left a hole at the center of the study of military innovation, which is curious given the fact that both military organizations and industrial defense producers mainly find themselves bound by law, of course. And our study seeks to fill a part of that hole. And by now, law firms have increasingly become interested in the protection of intellectual property in the national security sphere. And scholars of law have introduced a remarkable work on that subject. So why should we concentrate on intellectual property law? Historically, the security studies have paid a little attention to development in intellectual property law, beyond some comment about how technological innovation requires a wide-ranging legal support. And a few studies have concentrated on how the legal regime affects our military-industrial complex. And some other studies have focused on how the emerging international IP regime could affect the diffusion of military technology. And however, simultaneous developments in intellectual property law and in the nature of the defense industry suggest that the intersection of the two require greater attention. And intellectual property is crucial in the military industry for a variety of reasons. First, nowadays, the global defense industry depends more on foreign sales than ever before. The monopsony conditions, the single buyer's conditions that existed for most of the 20th century no longer exist. In fact, foreign buyers have represented a progressively increasing share of the industrial production since the end of the Cold War. So, declining defense budgets in Europe and Russia have forced arms manufacturers in those countries to focus on the market of foreign customs. And talking about the exports, there's a concern over export controls in technology transfer. It's about how foreign buyers will use and trade the intellectual property of arms and weapons producers. So, even European and Russian companies have begun to recognize the need to protect the innovation and trade secrets in order to remain in the commercial competition. Second, partnerships between firms have become more important than ever in the development of military technology. Many of the best-known military systems in the last decade have emerged from joint ventures between large producers and small non-traditional firms. So these partnerships intrinsically create the potential for conflicts over the ownership of technology and trade secrets, both between the firms themselves and between the firms and the government. And as far as the nature of intellectual property affects the predictions of profitability of these alliances, IP law has a direct impact on military innovation. And third, the defense industry has experienced both horizontal and vertical integrations that have diversified supply chains across numerous countries. For instance, a modern jet fighter contains components built in dozens of countries, often by hundreds of subcontractors. And this new reality has forced United States defense contractors to manage a variety of legal intellectual property regimes. And this had an impact on the manufacture of military equipment and the transfer of technology. So fourth, the political demand for defense contracting has grown steadily and has become more and more complex. And arms export agreements have increasingly taken on the character of transnational public-private partnerships. And for instance, in order to sell fighter jets, United States firms might have to agree to build components in the customer country, as well to transfer technology associated with the jet's weapon system. And this kind of commercial complexity creates the need for intricate legal arrangements that delineate where and how firms can transfer technology. And fifth, the dual use, military and civilian use of numerous technologies, especially those from the communication sector, has complicated the relationships that private firms have with the governments. And while most United States firms are pleased to sell US governments, few non-traditional providers envision the Department of Defense as their only customer, and rather they plan to sell their technological innovation for civilian purposes, hence the expression dual use. And however, the state interest in acquiring the intellectual property rights for data, patents, and trade secrets develop a kind of dual-use technology, and this stands in tension with those firms' commercial efforts. And sixth argument, the defense industry faces the same competition as firms in other sectors in the developed world. And firms in developing countries often have better access to local markets. They can take advantage of less rigorous local labor law or environmental laws in order to lower their costs and shorten their production schedules. So, with foreign firms having clear advantages in production and labor costs, the US industry needs to protect the area in which it maintains a competitive advantage. And I mean intellectual property and innovation. So this phenomenon has provided the motivation for many large corporations, especially in the United States, to press for stronger intellectual property protection in global trade forums. And seventh, over the last 5 decades, private firms have contributed an increasing percentage of total funds devoted to technological research and development. So at the same time, US government remains deeply involved in most defense-oriented research, committing substantial resources to the development of new weapons technologies. And consequently, most new military technology involves some mix of public and private funding and emerges from a mix of private and public institutions, for instance, research universities. And this creates problems with the ownership of the intellectual property that is associated with technological innovations. Problems that intellectual property law can either solve or intensify. Taken together, these trends points directly to two kinds of conclusions. First, doctrine on military innovation and diffusion has generally ignored the role displayed by intellectual property in the makeup of a defense industrial complex. And second, IP law potentially has a greater impact on the development and transfer of military technology than ever before. And this combination of absence of exploration and increased importance suggests that a full examination of the interaction of IP law and national security is deeply overdue now. So, the impact of intellectual property protection on the innovation and diffusion of military technology may prove deeply consequential for strategic competition in the 21st century. And concerns about innovation and diffusion of military technology have worried US defense since 1950s. The United States Department of Defense has pursued 3 offsets since the end of the World War II. US considered Russian numerical superiority and the continuing mobilization of the Soviet defense industry in wartime as key factors that threatened Western security. And technology would offset those advantages. So, the first offset, launched in the 1950s, was designed to preserve US and NATO technological superiority in the face of what was expected to be the overwhelming Soviet military superiority. And it concentrated on nuclear weapons and the systems needed to deliver them. And nevertheless, it also included conventional military aspects. The first offset carried both domestic and international implications for intellectual property law. On the domestic side, it deepened the production relationship between the big defense firms and the government, creating the military-industrial complex. And President Dwight Eisenhower memorably evoked this concept in his farewell address. This deepening led to a convenient relationship between private firms and the state, and relaxing the need for strict application of intellectual property law. And on the international side, the first offset was accompanied by government imposition of strict export controls on weapons and on military technology. So private firms accepted this imposition because they expected access to strong markets domestically and to NATO allies. A second offset, launched in the mid-1970s, was based on principles of the revolution in military affairs. And it involved pursuit of technologies associated with communications, computing, and long-range precision controls. The goal was to create the military capability to disturb Warsaw Pact's forces as they attacked NATO's central front. And the proponents of the second offset recognized the need for focusing on dual-use technologies, as civilian firms had in many cases displayed enough flexibility to move ahead of the counterparts. So, in combination with the careful use of government research funding, the second offset will maintain the position of the old defense firms while providing incentive for new contributors. And it would result, as its progenitors hoped, in the capacity of NATO forces to destroy the central nerves of the Warsaw Pact, to halt a Soviet advance in its tracks, and encourage the disintegration of the Red Army, even in satellite partners. The second offset also had a domestic and international implication for intellectual property law. On the domestic side, the complexity of introducing new players into the defense game required the development and the enforcement of new rules. And every firm had to be guaranteed in its chance to make profits. And this sat uneasily with the existence defense firm, but as they still controlled the overwhelming bulk of a huge market, they could accept some restrictions in order to maintain the positions. So, on the international side, the US government increased its efforts to control the export of technology to Warsaw Pact countries, repealing the transfer of dual-use technology, even on behalf of US allies. And the rules imposed by United States represented a de facto international regime for the control of intellectual property, as most of the NATO and major non-NATO allies, including Japan and South Korea, subscribed that restrictions. So the third offset was launched in 2014, seeks to preserve the superiority of US arms in the context of economic and technological growth of key competitors. And the third offset aims to influence the innovation of the US civilian economy to develop military technologies that significantly exceed the capabilities of their Chinese, Russian, and Indian counterparts. The authors of the third offset try to achieve this by focusing on even more on dual-use technologies. They try to enhance the ability of non-traditional defense providers to access the Department of Defense. And this represents a far greater threat to traditional providers than the second offset, as it comes during a period of US defense budget austerity and in the expectations that Chinese economic growth will continue to outperform the American one. And the third offset also assumes that experts' controls will fall as the digitalization of knowledge and the technology transfer in a globalized world economy will grant competitors an easy access to even the most innovative systems. So, all these three offset outcomes are tied to the core question that our study hopes to answer: how intellectual property law affects the production, the diffusion, and the innovation of military technology. So, this part of our conversation investigates the influence of IP on the international sale of arms and weapons products. So the modern defense industrial base has, since its beginning, supplied both domestic and international customers. And in the 19th century, the major arms producers of Europe began exporting military equipment, including ships, small arms, and artillery to smaller powers in Europe and around the world. The importers lacked the industrial technology to produce their own modern equipment. And they also represented a market which is too small to justify the development of a domestic arms industry of their own. In fact, large countries often fought wars almost entirely with equipment that came from Europe, just like in the Sino-Japanese War. And after World War II, American, Soviet, and European arms found their way to a newly independent governments around the world. So exporters have a motivation to control the intellectual property associated with their equipment in order to safeguard the efficacy of their weapons and to maintain the attractiveness of their exports. Importers, on the other hand, have different preferences. Some buyers are satisfied with the acquisition of finished equipment and will do contracts with the seller for maintenance and replacements. Other buyers want the technology and intellectual property associated with the weapons they buy. And some may want to produce the weapons themselves. And at this point, intellectual property intervene. And in general, importers and exporters have different interests. And the contractual agreement design take place within a framework generally structured within intellectual property law. And sometimes weapons transfer carry no IP beyond that which is present in the weapons themselves. At other times, export arrangements will include the provision for technology transfer associated with maintenance, and other agreements put in place the foundation for joint production, which involves the transfer of patented technologies and trade secrets associated with manufacturing. And national governments have generally supported arms sales for both economic and political reasons. On the economic side, exports often generate a very high percentage of defense industrial base's total sales. And in addition to initial sales, the transfer of military equipment generally comes with a set of long-term agreements and maintenance and for the upgrades. And these long-term agreements and contracts are sometimes more lucrative than the initial sale. And on a political side, arms export can help to ensure a long-term political relationship. The need for service and for updates can lock a client into a very long relationship with a patron. And advanced systems often require a long-term advising presence as well in order to ensure the proper employment and maintenance of the weapons. So arms transfers can also increase the strength of proxies and help secure the terms of an alliance. But while arms deals bring clear benefits, they also have pitfalls. Selling a weapon to another state carries the straightforward threat that the buyer will use the weapon against the exporter. During the Falkland War, Argentina used several British-designed and built destroyers and a Colossus-class aircraft carrier, all sold to Buenos Aires in previous happy times. The threat of regime can change, and it can also make sellers suspicious of the transfers of some systems. For example, the reluctancy of the United States to accelerate the transfer of the F-16 Vipers to the Iraqi Air Force has come in part from the concerns over the future of the Baghdadi government. So, indeed, the desire to control exports played a role in developing intellectual property protection and at the beginning of the modern defense industrial base. And for instance, part of the US government has an interest in getting the property rights of torpedo technology, and it comes from an interest in preventing the exportation of that technology to potential competitors. And in fact, the US government was so concerned about keeping torpedo technology in the hands of the state that they use anti-espionage statutes to claim partial ownership of it. And states also face a variety of political obstacles to arms exports. Allies can have a significant effect on arms export decision, with one government pressuring another not to export advanced systems. So, the United States, for instance, they place a great pressure on other European countries and Israel as well to restrict export to China. In addition to political obstacles, states can also face legal obstacles for exporting weapons. After the Tiananmen Square onslaught in China, for instance, the European Union imposed an arms embargo that has lasted until the current day. And the United Nations has imposed a variety of arms embargoes in history, usually against conflict areas, just to prevent the escalation. On a unilateral basis, the United States has imposed numerous arms embargoes against unfriendly nations based on a wide variety of justifications. Such unilateral embargoes can have a greater impact than unilateral sanctions because of the market positions of big suppliers and because of the long-term nature of a military relationship. So, the suspension of a relationship between states can leave existing equipment non-functional and useless. Finally, international legal agreements have tightly restricted the transfer of some kinds of military technology. The Chemical Weapon Convention restrict, for instance, the transfer of equipment and chemicals necessary to the development of chemical weapons. And however, not every attempt to institute international legal controls on weapon sales has succeeded. Most recently, various NGOs have called for limitations on the exports and the use of autonomous weapons. And in short, states have a great interest in exporting military equipment, but also face some important obstacles. Some of these obstacles take political form, while others rest on legal prohibitions. And the arms trade, consequently, is ideal for investigating how intellectual property law might affect the diffusion of military technology across the international system. And we'll discuss now about how the variation tools affect the management of intellectual property concerns, and especially in the diffusion of military technology. And we'll finish talking about a quantitative investigation of some aspects of the relationship between US arms exports and rates of intellectual property in buyer's country. So, licensing represents the least complex form of intellectual property transfer. The licensing state receives technology and legal approval in return of financial and other consideration. Licensing agreements may also prohibit re-export of equipment, even if only limited legal means exist to enforce this prohibition. Historically, states licensed the production of military equipment outside their borders. And such agreements were common even in the communist world, which otherwise lacked strong intellectual property protection. In the wake of World War II, for example, the Soviet Union often licensed the production of tanks, aircraft, and small arms to its satellites in the Eastern Europe, as well as to China. And these agreements allowed Warsaw Pact countries to produce equipment under license. And this enabled USSR to increase its own capabilities by increasing those of its allies and satellites, and to take advantage of their own industrial capacity. So the technology transfer associated with such deals could survive the diplomatic condition that made the agreement possible. For instance, China continued to produce Soviet-designed submarines long after the Sino-Soviet split. The licensing state has limited tools for preventing such violation beyond bilateral measures such as sanctions, tariffs, and the seizure of property. And the expansion of the international IP regime may offer more tools for enforcement, however. The concept of technology transfer has merited a rich and extensive literature in the economic development fields. Broadly speaking, scholars define technology transfer as the passing of industrial techniques, engineering know-how, data from a country to another. And this necessarily requires the transfer of patents and trade secrets. And since at least World War II, technology transfer has played an important role in the arms trade. The devastating effect of the war on the industry of continental Europe and Japan, combined with the heavy American capital investment in military technology, made the US enjoy a massive technological advance over its NATO partners. And the United States tried to increase European military capability as well as European economic prosperity. And this facilitated the transfer of military and non-military technology to European industry. And the US, however, placed direct limits on how its allies could use this technology in order to prevent its transfer to a communist bloc. Contemporary arms negotiations have increasingly revolved around questions of technology transfer. Data transfer also represents an increasingly large concern in arms trade. However, it's likely to spot in this setting the classic trade-off associated with international military technology transfer, increased cooperation and profit in exchange for potentially decreased national security. The globalization of the defense industry has ongoing implications on the arms trade and for intellectual property protection. First, any relationship between a contractor and a subcontractor in high technology fields requires an agreement of the ownership of intellectual property. Subcontractors want to protect their trade secrets and patent rights, while the contractors want access to as much data as possible in order to ensure long-term viability. And when the relationship between two firms crosses a border, it also crosses two systems of intellectual property protection, and making the IP negotiations even more difficult. Second, a firm's decision to subcontract across a border often requires the transfer of technology from the contractor to the subcontractor, and this transfer can fail the interests of national governments to maintain control of their defense technology. That is manifested in the form of export controls. And this international technology transfer, again, requires a negotiation between two systems of intellectual property, along with the management of the export control requirements and the government's demands for national security. So third, the joint production, the development and the subcontracting of dual-use components falls under the protection of the international intellectual property regime. And it's rather than under any negotiations between firms and governments. And this means that even if firms and national governments try to avoid the procedures mandated by multinational intellectual property agreements, the subcontractors of their components still rely on those agreements in order to protect their property. And indeed, government can sometimes use international subcontracting to short-circuit patent claims by domestic rights holders. In the case Zoltek versus United States, for example, a court held that while a government contractor had indeed infringed upon one of Zoltek's patents, and we are talking about the stealth covering system of the F-22 Raptor fighter, the government was not liable. And it was not liable because the contractor had completed part of the process outside the United States. And these complications can have significant geopolitical consequences. Recently, for example, concerns over intellectual property regulation have caused problems in the rising military relationship between the United States and India. Despite these complications, scholars have shown that the globalization of production in the defense sphere increases innovation. And states taking advantage of globalization and stating and pointing out that they can produce more effective weaponry generally exclude the possibility and the chance that they can fall behind. The question becomes the degree to which states can pursue a strategy of globalization while also seeking to protect the most innovative technologies from potential competitors. As we will see now, the globalization of arms industry offers important tools for managing the diffusion of military technology. Let's talk about export controls. National security, let's say, concerns about the fact that some states can export their most advanced military technology. And officially and unofficially, many arms exporters employ export controls to prevent technology from ending up in foreign weapons systems. And the desire to control the rate of diffusion of technology is the central reason why states place legal limits on weapons and dual-use technology transfer. Anyway, political factors also play a very big role in some export control systems. For instance, the case United States versus Curtis Wright, ruling that the Roosevelt administration had the authority to prevent the export of military technology to Bolivia, offered the basic legal foundation for export management. And after the war ended, US planners believed that they would require a significant technological advantage to balance the numerical superiority of the Soviet military. So, consequently, they created strict rules on the export of equipment with military applications. For example, these rules forced private US firms to seek approval from the US government for the transfer of sensitive technologies. And essentially, the new regime placed limits on the rights of defense and other firms to control over the intellectual property. These rules established by the US government only became stricter after World War II. And through the medium of export controls, therefore, intellectual property protection formed a core aspect of a U.S. strategy in the Cold War. And moreover, the U.S. strategy for technology management had an international effect. Even if the U.S. designed the system to prevent its own companies from transferring technology to Soviet Union, in practice, many friendly states found themselves the target of export controls due to concerns over secondary transfer and espionage. So, the international expression of export controls was the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, more commonly known as COCOM, which came into effect in 1950. And the United States leaned hard on allied states, mostly Japan and the members of the NATO alliance, just to limit the transfer of military and dual-use technology to the Soviet bloc and to customers tied to the Soviet bloc. So the export control system had a deep impact on the movement of people and knowledge, and the system of protection that concentrated on the movement of things in the 1940s and 50s soon turned to its attention to people. And this is manifested not only in the visa regulations applied to international scholars and engineers, but also to classificatory scheme designed to prevent suspect individuals from accessing to critical knowledge. And even the spread of unclassified information became problematic, if it might lead naturally to the revelation of classified knowledge. And so, concluding, the United States needs strongly to reform its approach to intellectual property in the defense sphere. The current IP practice of the Department of Defense make more difficult to pursue the Pentagon's goal of diversifying the procurement base beyond the large traditional firms. And current IP practice puts small civilian-oriented firms in jeopardy with respect to their position in the civilian market, to their legal weakness to the government, and to their ability to conclude productive partnerships with defense-oriented firms. So first, the Department of Defense should reform its legal approach to the state's secrets privilege, and this in order to allow the firms to press charges in case of infringement. And the abuse of the state secrets privilege not only damages specific firms that have an interest in defense contract, it also chills the enthusiasm of civilian firms for working in partnerships with traditional defense providers. So, as demonstrated in the famous case Lucent versus Crater, the owner has a constitutional right to compensation for the taking, where the government has directly misappropriated a trade secret. And during a trial before a judge, the suppression of the evidence needed to prove the owner's trade secret claim that is justified under the national security umbrella removes this constitutionally mandates remedy. So equally problematic is the deterring effect of the U.S. government destruction of inventors' claims that will fall unreasonably on smaller businesses. So, this conflicts with the argument of the Department of Defense that smaller firms will need to produce a substantial share of the next generation of defense technology for the sake of nation security. And this result is also consistent with the Department of Defense stated goals of encouraging small firms to consider it as a potential customer for technological innovation. Smaller firms are already facing substantial obstacles in breaking into the defense procurement market, lack the political influence to ensure that the military will properly license the technology. And as a result, these firms must rely primarily on legal protection rather than political influence to defend their intellectual property rights. And if the application of the state's secrets privilege deprives these smaller inventors of this protection, they might be reluctant to pursue military inventions, of course. And in essence, the nation's long-term defense strategy is being taken hostage by a short-term litigation strategy. Department of Defense should modify its IP acquisition practices to ensure that civilian firms feel securely in control of their intellectual property. This includes simplifying the procurement process in order to allow to these firms to have a greater confidence in the security of their property. And the Department of Defense should also take a more flexible attitude on the acquisition of trade secrets and patent rights from civilian-oriented firms, recognizing that changes in the nature of procurement have rendered some traditional practice of procurement totally obsolete. More broadly, the U.S. government should keep an eye on best international practices for handling defense IP. The defense firms have adapted slowly to the new intellectual property landscape, in part because it has not been necessary so far for them to adapt quickly. And consequently, they missed out the ability to contribute to the formulation of the international IP regime. So far, the dominant U.S. defense corporations remain in a uniquely profitable position with respect to the formulation of international IP rules. And at the end, we could say that United States remains the world's largest arms exporter, and the U.S. defense, the U.S. defense firms have subsidiaries and subcontractors all over the world, and they exercise a great influence on the security decisions for foreign governments. while the US governments cannot prevent all instances of industrial espionage, it can start an international legal framework in which US defense producers can retaliate against the piracy of military IP. And this framework can help to replace the arrangement that characterized US relations with its allies during the Cold War. And it can also provide tools for fighting infringement by non-allies, largely by outlining measures for retaliation against individuals or corporates and state-based offenders. And the World Intellectual Property Organization has in fact already put in place programs designed to establish particular respect for IP law within the legal systems of developing countries. And even if the Trans-Pacific Partnership has failed and the future of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership remains uncertain, bilateral efforts will surely continue to support this multicultural structure. And these efforts may serve to make transnational integration of the global defense industry easier, much easier in the very near future. So, I stop here, and thank you very much for your attention, and if there are any questions, I'm fully available. Thank you very much.